Welcome to another exciting episode of Cyber Coast to Coast. This is Craig Schober here on the West Coast out in Long Beach, California, and I'm joined by my brother Scott. Hey Scott, how you doing?
Hey, how's it going there? Glad to catch up with you here on the East Coast, here right outside New York City.
Great. This is uh, I don't want to say a special episode, but it's almost a themed episode. If you're listening to this, undoubtedly you've already heard about the attacks on Russia against the Ukraine, and in both terms of physical traditional warfare and the cyber warfare. And obviously we're this podcast we deal with the cyber, and so we're going to do all cyber warfare related stories and all of the fallout from that stuff and how it impacts us here. So I guess before we get right into it, I just want to mention that this episode is sponsored by Cyberlytica. Cyberlytica is proactive cybercrime intelligence, and you can learn more about all their offerings for corporate, enterprise, and even personal on their website, www.cyberlytica.com. Find out all the stuff they do, the dark web and beyond. Let's get into this first story here. There were so many stories to choose from because this war, it's terrible and it's still unfolding, and you're getting calls like crazy to do interviews about this stuff. I'm kind of sweeping news sites to see what's good for this episode and beyond, and posting things on the social media end. So I just grabbed this one from MSN.com, and I thought it was interesting because, the headline is "Disturbing Mass Text Operation Terrorizes Ukraine as Russian troops move in." And what seems to be going on here is, as we know, we've seen years of this. The Soviet Union, Soviet Union, that shows my age. Russia has engaged in socially engineered attacks and all types of things, and kind of in the name of almost chaos and mayhem, against their enemies. Now we see this kind of play out in another phase in the middle of this attack on Ukraine in the form of text messages. Apparently, both soldiers and civilians even have been getting these text messages saying things like, flee or you'll be killed. We see they're getting text messages about ATMs not working properly. So there's confusion, economic confusion in banking and those type of things that creates panic. They're getting these messages through both the carriers and through things like Telegram. Telegram is the secured app that is very popular overseas, and it's gaining popularity here too because of its end-to-end encryption. What do you think about this? How effective is this kind of thing to do against both citizens and soldiers?
Well, I think it's scary because thinking about it right now, if you're a Ukrainian soldier and you're already nervous with 190,000 troops around your border, planes, troops on the ground, missiles being launched, cyber attacks, and now they're targeting, it feels like you as an individual when it's your smartphone. When you're receiving texts and you start looking, you're saying they're hitting people, they're hitting the soldiers from every single angle. And that's got to be concerning. And there were early reports this week of massive DDoS attacks, which we'll talk about, and wiper malware that was placed on hundreds of government computers. So if you look at it, every single angle, the Ukrainians are being attacked, and Russia really planned this in advance to hit every possible thing. And I think when you're targeting anybody's phone, you take it more personal. When I get a text and it's a scam, or I get a robocall, it annoys me. I get frustrated.
Mm.
So you can't do your job. You get distracted for the moment, especially if you're driving in a car or you're trying to finish a thought and you get down to your phone. So now I'm trying to imagine how they feel here. They're sitting in a trench somewhere with a gun waiting to be attacked.
Mhm.
And now they're receiving these fake text messages alerting them of all kinds of crazy things. It's really horrific.
Yeah, it's like a new form of psychological warfare and on a
Yeah.
massive scale. Because I mean, think of it. I don't, these. I'm sure these soldiers aren't in the trenches with their phones necessarily, but they do have access to their phones
Mhm.
so that they can reach loved ones back. Who are supposed to be safe. Not on the front, the fighting front, but to know that the enemy can send you messages on your phone as well as sending your family propaganda and threats and messages. That's got to be a new type of psychological warfare that we haven't seen
Absolutely.
on this scale.
Yeah. And I think the underlying thing that we clearly see, and again, I'm trying to stay neutral in this, but just from an outside, from a technology perspective, it clearly appears that the government of Russia is instilling um, doubt, confusion, fear toward their enemy, that being Ukraine, and anybody that's considered an ally to it, which means that some of the fallout from this may be some focused cyber attacks to United States. I know the financial institutions were on high alert this week,
Mhm.
fearing that they would be targeted. Wall Street, the various banks, investing companies, everybody's on high alert here in the United States, fearing that they may too be victim just by guilty by association kind of thing as an ally to Ukraine, even though they're not actively engaged in this actual ongoing conflict or war that's happening.
Yeah, remember, this reminds me of. I'm thinking back about, I think it was 2018. There was that. It was I don't know if it was a slow news day or what, but this story still sticks out of my mind. Remember when it was like a emergency uh messaging system, and it was Hawaii, and
Yes,
there was
yes.
something like incoming missiles, take cover, this is not a drill kind of thing. And of course it turned out to be a total mistake. But I remember everyone saying like, well, what happened if hackers got control and sent these texts out to everyone and created mass panic?
Mhm.
That's kind of what this reminds me of. It's like they now have the keys to the phones, to the carriers, to the communication platform, and they're sending out insane messages to you know wear down their enemy. And how do you protect yourself from stuff like this? It's almost like you just have to turn your phone off. You have to have a
Yep.
really really strong filter on in your brain to filter this kind of stuff out, so that you don't feel dejected and
Mhm.
you don't do something you're going to regret, or you don't go crazy and withdraw all your money from the bank, or speed off looking for somewhere safe to go, just based on a text message saying you're not safe, get out of your house, or whatever they're saying. Yeah, it's certainly a worry.
Yeah, I do think that one statement in that article that it talks about how they received text messages about the ATMs were not functioning
Mm,
in an effort to create panic. And I'm just thinking in my own mind when I heard that this war was underway the other day, and right away I started thinking about not just the loss of human lives, which is really the most catastrophic thing and terrible, but you make it personal and you say, geez, how does it affect my life, my family, my business? And one thing that stood out is all the talk about gasoline prices going up,
mm,
which is kind of stupid, but it's a real threat and it affects global economies. And right away I said, maybe I should go fill up my SUV,
mhm,
which is crazy because what does it really matter? Well, it's going to go up a few dollars maybe, or percentage, more to fill up at the tank, but that's not the bigger picture. But that's what's on people's minds. Unfortunately, in America, they're thinking about price at the pump maybe.
mhm,
Um, people over there are probably thinking a lot more in Ukraine about their poor families and how are they going to survive this whole thing? Should they escape? And so a lot of people are uneasy, but when they create panic like this, when they create confusion, that being Russia, it really undermines how people could stay safe.
Yeah, definitely makes you uh, take stock in what matters here. Where right now it's just kind of lobbying economic sanctions over against Russia. And so there's always going to be a reaction. And so we feel the economic sting here in little ways and possibly big ways, but it's nothing compared to the sting that the Ukraine itself is feeling right now.
Yeah, so true.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that brings us to our next story, which is, these stories are all just kind of an extension of each other since we're dealing with the same territories and the same timeline and, and similar things. But this one came from CNBC. Cyber attack hits Ukrainian banks and government websites. That's the simple headline.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. You mentioned the banks and of course this adds government websites on top of that. What it seems to be is a DDoS attack, which is a distributed denial of service attack. And we've seen these used for years now in both in terms of cyber warfare things, but also in terms of just kind of consumer services and things being attacked by hackers that either disagree or they're maybe the company refused to pay ransomware or what do you think is going on here in terms of DDoS? Is this just a Russian launching DDoS at Ukraine and all their allies? And do you think, what's the likelihood that the US sees some of this fallout in terms of DDoS on our internet over here?
Yeah, I think it is possible. We think about DDoS attacks and distributed denial of service attacks. Oftentimes, they're using IoT bots to really launch these targeted attacks. Imagine an army of hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of botnets that are really flooding a targeted website, so it just can't handle the traffic. So it's more of a disruptor, kind of similar to what we were just talking about with text message alerts to people's phones. It instills confusion or doubt or creates panic. Kind of the same thing. Imagine you're the government, you try to access your website or update things, and now suddenly it doesn't even work. It doesn't load. You're frustrated. And what do is you question your internet speed. You get like kind of flustered. I know we've had internet traffic out here for the day when they're doing work on our industrial park, and it's frustrating. You can't check your email. You can't communicate. If you have IP-based phones, your whole day is ruined. So if you think about this now, they're dealing with this. And it's not that it's a country that doesn't have internet that works well. In fact, they're ranked in the world, I think, the 77th as far as global internet speed, which I thought was an interesting statistic. And they actually offer the world's cheapest broadband. So that means it's readily available to just about all citizens. So it's affordable. That means they're all dependent upon it. So Russia's using that as part of their strategy to send out to these government websites, because people are probably reaching out to them for help. People are reaching out to their banks to find out what bank is open, what ATMs do work. They're panicking. And that, again, is what they're really trying to do. These short focused DDoS attacks that flood or jam this traffic to their networks and make it difficult. How do you resolve it? There's not a whole lot of things you can do when you're in the middle of everything. There's proactive things you could do. I mean, prior to having a DDoS attack, obviously, the bigger the pipe, having more bandwidth, it would allow your organization to absorb more and handle larger volumes of traffic. I mean, that's kind of a given, but in the situation they're at, in Ukraine, they're not going to pick up the phone and call their broadband provider and say, "Hey, can I increase my volume of traffic or anything like that?" The damage is already done. The site's offline. People can't access it. It's a disaster, and that's what really happens. And to launch a DDoS attack, you can go onto the dark web and you can hire a hacker. And I've seen them as low as $6 or $7 targeting a specific website for a duration of time. So you could say, "Hey, I want to take out my competitor's website at 4 to 5 p.m. today. It's going to cost me $7 to do that." And they could easily do that. Russia could, they have the capability of doing themselves with all of their state sponsored hacking and things that go on, but they could also hire a bunch of hackers to do it. And we'll talk about that. What are hackers doing kind of in response out there in the wild in a little bit with, I think, toward the end of this discussion. It's interesting now. It really is interesting how powerful a DDoS attack can be, yet how low cost it is to actually launch it and how difficult it is to stop or prevent it.
Mm. And when you were talking about DDoS, it clogs up the pipes, I guess. But it didn't. It's, from what I gather, it's not a kind of an attack on base communications. They're not trying to shut down the entire internet. They're not pulling the cable. They're not trying to shut down all the carriers so that no one in the Ukraine can communicate at all. They're trying to, like you said, disrupt sort of lifestyle and sometimes critical life services, some infrastructure in there too, so that people can't access their banks. They can't communicate with a company to get a ride somewhere. They can't do their online shopping. They can't, just all those little things that add up that make kind of modern life what it is for those people. That's all disrupted. Absolutely. And so now everyone's kind of on their own. I guess that's where DDoS really comes into play. It's massive in scale, and yet it's targeted in a certain way. You're not just pulling the plug.
And I think in this case, what it does do is it really sends a message to the Ukrainian government, because it's such a focused attack. Imagine they pulled the plug on the internet for all of Ukraine. That is a very different statement and feel than having a focused attack that targets the government, that targets the banking in Ukraine. Very different message there is sent. So it's not directly affecting maybe students that are in Ukraine or the mom or whoever else. So it's a little bit different of a message. It is more focused toward those that they're fighting against, the Ukrainian soldiers. That's what I think is happening. And the government, that's where they're having a challenge, and that's where it's sending the message and doing the most damage.
Yeah. Okay. Well, before we move on to our third and final story, just want to remind listeners one more time that this episode is sponsored by Cyberattacks, who provides proactive cybercrime intelligence. Learn more on cyberattacks.com. And they do all things dark web, and you can learn all you want on their website for your business or personal needs. This third story is kind of a taken from our perspective more in terms of what our options are for kind of dipping our toe, as a country into this war, because of course we don't want to get involved, but of course we have to get involved in some little ways. And the question is, do you want to get involved in larger ways? Because I know the last thing that anyone wants here is to scale this up and turn it into a real physical conflict. So the U.S. has begun with kind of economic sanctions, and of course there's other options that come from that. And this story comes from NBCnews.com, and it's about Biden, and he was presented with various options for massive attacks against Russia. Some of them were involved just shutting off power, via cyber attack. So that's a critical infrastructure attack. Some of them were about stopping and kind of messing with the train schedule, which almost sounds like we did a story a couple weeks back. Remember in Belarus, and it was more. It wasn't as serious as this. I mean, I wouldn't categorize it as hijinks, but it was kind of to get attention, and it was kind of making a political statement, and I don't believe it was for money. That particular story, but this is different. This is when you shut down or confuse a railway, you now create opportunity to completely disrupt the transport of military vehicles, for instance, or even troops, and that can really wreak havoc on the Ukraine, as I'm sure Russia's doing. And should the US do something like this to Russia now, that could wreak havoc on their operations. It could save many lives, when you don't get those guns, those bullets, those tanks and missiles and troops to where they need to be. You don't have a conflict, but you can't do that kind of stuff and not expect retaliation from Russia either. So I don't know. What do you think? Is this a slippery slope to escalation and getting the U.S. involved in a place where we don't want to be?
Yeah, well, I guess any act of aggression that the United States would take from a U.S. intelligence and military perspective using American cyber weapons could be viewed as part of an act of war. It could be very dangerous, and it may cross that slippery slope. I've been talking about a lot about it this week, and just the aspect you brought up an interesting point about the potential things that the Biden administration in the U.S. could use. They could disrupt the trains. And if you think about it, in Russia, there's approximately 12,000 trains throughout Russia that are used. Between the majority of them are, the electric freight locomotives, some diesel locomotives, and then of course a couple thousand passenger trains as well. But all of those trains are interconnected and tied in through internet and for signaling and sensors and so on and so forth. The Internet of Things is certainly a huge part of the rail industry globally. So if you think about that, if the United States did do a focused, targeted attack just against rails, the rail, it would cause major havoc, transporting of goods, transporting of people. It would affect their economy overnight. Is that right or wrong? I'm not necessarily here to say. I'm just here talking about it from a technological standpoint and disruptive standpoint. Man, when you couple that with other possible things, like you mentioned, maybe disrupt Russia's internet, disrupt their power grid. Some of those things are certainly doable with the advanced cyber weapons that the United States has at its disposal. We don't hear about United States ever doing these things, though. Probably the only known event that really is a standout for me is go back a number of years to Stuxnet, where America and Israeli partnered forces targeting Iranian centrifuges there for nuclear enrichment, and they would speed up the centrifuge to melt it down and really put them years behind in their development of nuclear weapons. So it was a very effective tactic, but it was really the first use of what I would call a cyber weapon, and pretty amazing how far things have come. It reminded me a chapter that you and I authored in our second book there, Cybersecurity is Everybody's Business, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. We talk about the disruption to rail and aviation and auto by means of cyber attacks and some of the implications associated to that. And they can be devastating to a country.
Yeah. All this really gets me curious about how just how not effective, but also deadly it's going to become. We've everything's been theoretical up until now. We've had years of talk about what cyber warfare is really like, but we've never had it in practice. We know we've had things go on between countries, but that stuff's all top secret. And so it only leaks out here and there every once in a while when there'll be some kind of scandal, and some kind of whistleblower will come forth,
Mhm.
or WikiLeaks, and all those type of things. Now we're seeing it before it leaks. We're seeing the US investigating kind of openly the possibility of doing, weighing their options. And we're going to actually see the impact for the first time from this stuff. We're going to finally learn, possibly, if an attack on critical infrastructure, a cyber attack on critical infrastructure, is that more deadly than a physical attack on the battlefield. It's a terrible premise. I mean, is the body count going to be worse when you shut off the power grid or the water supply to citizens than if you bomb a city with bombs, actual bombs that destroy buildings and kill people on contact? These are things that we kind of never would have known until now, and unfortunately I think we're going to learn some of these things the hard way.
Yeah, I think it's true. And I think the ease of initiating a cyber attack, a cyber war, can't be underestimated. What do I mean by that? It took, I believe it was over the period of several months of troop buildup, close to 200,000 troops almost surrounding Ukraine, because you have all the logistics. You just don't have people moving, but you've got planes and you've got tanks and you've got all the supply chain logistics, the petroleum that has to follow to fill the tanks when they run out of gas, and the food to feed the people, so on and so forth. You've got a mobile army. That takes preparation, that takes time, that takes money, it takes investment. And now look at a cyber war. It can be done from a computer or computers with hiring some hackers, state sponsored hackers, for a fixed cost. And yet, as you mentioned, if you take out water, electric, affect nuclear, affect communications, internet, so on and so forth, that could have long-term devastating consequences. I think there's 5 million people approximately in Ukraine. Probably a lot less now as they're trying to escape to Poland and surrounding countries and things. But the effect it has on people's lives, cyber warfare, it affects, as you mentioned earlier, it enters people's minds. So the psychology of it is scary.
Mhm.
The fear that it instills is scary. The chaos, the dollar damage is devastating to an economy, and it's hard to recoup. I was thinking specifically, the type of malware that was dispensed on hundreds of government computers that researchers discovered this week on Ukrainian government computers was called wiper malware, which basically wipes it. So you start your computer up and there's nothing there. It destroys it. You lose the content. You don't have access to your operating system and your files and things. That's really devastating. How different it is than the traditional ransomware attack that we see dispensed, where you pay a fee, you get your data back. There's some hope there. This is really a cyber war where they're sending out hopeless attacks. They're doing something where it's wiping your machine, rendering your computer to be useless. Now it's a brick. What can you do with that? Nothing.
Mhm.
That to me is devastating. And I think it kind of underscores how serious a cyber war can be and how disruptive it is. I don't think any of us truly know how bad it's going to be if a full cyber war takes place, because now there's going to be a retaliatory attack. If there's an attack to the US and the Biden administration deems it necessary to attack back, they're probably going to pull out all the stops and do a lot more. And that's going to cause another retaliation from perhaps an ally of Russia. Imagine if the US retaliates to Russia, now China steps in,
Mm.
or one of the other allies to China in Russia and Iran or somebody else. That's scary.
Yeah. There was a, I saw that the Ukraine recently just put out kind of a plea for the hacking community to come to their aid and fight, against Russia in any way they can. And then another story just came over just moments ago about Anonymous. Now, apparently they're getting into the fight. Twitter, there, if you go on to at your Anon News, that's, I guess, their official Twitter account, where they made the statement and claim they have they do have 6.5 million followers, but they, claim to have hackers under their banner all over the world. Anonymous doesn't claim to be from any one particular, they don't hail from any country. So I don't know how this would, I don't know how this would come across if they imagine they attack Russia with a DDoS attacks or whatever they're going to do. Like, who does Russia blame? Do they blame the US? I don't even know what would come of that. But it's getting interesting to see the allies now. People, people are picking sides and preparing to take action. So we're going to see some action, I'm sure. I just hope it's minimal in terms of real damage and death.
Yeah, that you make a really good point. How can you attribute who has initiated the cyber attack? If you look at NATO, for example, I would assume that any attack against Russia would assume, hey, this is either coming from Ukraine or from somebody from NATO, one of the countries. And there's 30 supporting countries as part of NATO. So that's a tall order to actually try to do the forensics and figure it out, or to suddenly Russia just say, well, now we're going to retaliate and go attack anybody that's associated with NATO. I don't know. It's a mess, though, and it's very concerning for that from that standpoint. And just the fact that Anonymous is in the game going after Russia shows kind of public outcry for the atrocities of war. Enough is enough. They don't want Russia to proceed and kill innocent people and do all this stuff. And they're using the power that they have of the computer to fight back with these ones and zeros. And I think that's a pretty strong statement against what Russia is doing. And again, it's hard to stay neutral and stay out of the conversations from a political standpoint, but you could see that Anonymous must be fed up, because usually they only take on situations that really aggravate them. And some of the things they do seem very just, almost like a vigilante, I would say.
Right. Hacktivism.
Yeah, hacktivism. And other things they do are just downright wrong. I mean, a number of years ago from our first book, Hacked Again, I remember some of the hackers that were targeting our company and myself were associated with Anonymous. Now, were we doing anything wrong? We were educating people, sharing tips so people could stay safe from cyber criminals. Well, not all of Anonymous are that friendly or that kind to others. So they are kind of hacktivists that for good or for evil or whatever their intended purpose. And there's lots of people out there associated to Anonymous and the hacktivist community. So it could actually be very disruptive, and they're extremely hard to catch. They are technical wizards. They're not dummies. They know what they're doing. So it may actually be a difficult for Russia to try to retaliate against this unknown group that they can't really locate.
Yeah, I think they're in a different league. I mean, there might be degrees of skill within Anonymous, but when you attack nation states as a group and make proclamations against entire countries or continents, you have to know what you're doing. You're not hacking into someone's bank account to steal some money. You're making big claims, and you have to back those up with true anonymity, and you can, in other words, they can't trace you, or you're done. So when you're fighting against all the best hackers that Russia has or the US has to offer. You have to make sure your tracks are clear and they can't trace anything back to you. So we're going to be watching all of these stories closely, um, and as well as anonymous, and see what they do and see what they bring to the table. But before we go, just wanted to catch up and see. I know you're getting tons of requests to do interviews and all types of things. What are some that stick out in your head? Where can we send some of our listeners if they want to learn more about what you're what you want to say on this?
Yeah, I have been hit by a lot of different news agencies. Some of them actually are lined up already for next week. They want to discuss the fallout from this weekend from a cyber perspective. What are some of my thoughts? So I'm kind of going to be tuning in throughout the weekend as well. But I did an interesting interview on Pix 11 out of New York this week. I did one for RTVI, which is actually a New York American Russian television. It's really funded by, I guess, the Russians, to get a perspective on some of the cybersecurity centers that were the new one that's just set up in Brooklyn, New York, in your neighborhood there, and how that's being used to counter some of the attacks that Russia and China have initiated from a cyber perspective, and how America's setting up these different cybersecurity centers in different cities to combat these growing threats, especially to protect critical infrastructure. I did an interview earlier today on NTD television that's was recorded. It's actually airing right now. Again, talking about this conflict, this cyber conflict. There's a couple magazines that I did some interviews that'll be appearing next week. On Monday, I'll be talking to the National Enquirer. There's a story that they're putting together on this. So tons and tons of stuff. I've got so many things lined up. And everybody wants just kind of like different angles and perspective as these things slowly unfold. So it is kind of fascinating how cybersecurity is now at the forefront of such a massive war. And here we are in a sense on the other side of the world, yet it affects us. It's affecting Americans. It's affecting people globally, as cybersecurity is now, I think, something that involves all of our lives. And it really tells us we all got to be safe. So there are things that we can do. And I was sharing tips in a lot of these interviews that it is important that we protect our families, our businesses, keeping our information safe with long and strong passwords, making sure if we haven't used multi-factor authentication, start using it across all the platforms. It's really, really important. Don't reuse our same password across multiple login sites. Anytime there's any type of major event in life, we talked about the pandemic a number of weeks ago, all the cyber criminals come out and they initiate phishing campaigns. So we're going to probably see a slew of phishing campaigns and political campaigns all tied to the war, getting people to weigh in, getting people to sign up for petitions, getting people to donate money, all kinds of things, and many of which are going to be just scams by cyber criminals. So again, we have to put our red flags up immediately when we start seeing all these suspicious things. If you get a phone call, a text, a phishing email, an inducement to a pop-up that you're on the internet checking out the news cycle, and a pop-up to click here, be extra cautious and vigilant, especially during these times of have heightened security, especially things tied to our banking, because again, the financial institutions are being targeted. And that's one of the biggest areas that the warnings went out this week throughout America. Well, the financial institutions, is Russia targeting them? Well, I would say my guess is yes. So just be really, really careful and extra vigilant, everybody out there listening.
All right. Good sound advice in a crazy time.
Yeah.
Well, and if anyone wants to learn more about your appearances and stuff, I think the best place they can go is scottschober.com. That's kind of like the home base hub for all of your, you know, media publications you've been quoted in, podcasts that we record, all your network TV news appearances and the like. And also, your Twitter is what is it, at Scott BVS, right?
Yes, correct. Yep.
And
That's a great way to reach out. DM me. I am on Facebook. I'm on Instagram, Scott_Schober. Feel free, reach out to me, connect with me. Feel free to follow the stories and share your feedback. I had some great feedback from different listeners already, just from our first half dozen episodes of this series, Cyber Coast to Coast. And so far, the feedback's been really great, positive stuff. They're asking for more stories, more tips, the links to where all our stories are so they can read them over afterwards, and where they can visit the tips. So just like you shared there, go to scottschober.com. We're going to have the tips up there. We're going to have a lot of e-papers, all the links to different things that we're doing and what we're involved in. And that way you could stay informed. And do me a favor, if you like some of these things, share them, share the tips with your friends, with your coworkers. That way we could all work together to stay safer. And I think that's really important. It does take a village for us to fight back against cyber criminals. So I think it's important to do that. And two, I want to put a shout out. If you do like this episode of Cyber Coast to Coast, please give it a rating. Take 2 minutes and go on your favorite podcast station there and give it a rating, like on Apple iTunes or whatever else, wherever you listen for it, and give it a rating and an honest review. We really appreciate that, the feedback, as we're growing. And we have more and more companies reaching out to ask if they could sponsor. If you're interested in sponsoring, again, shoot us a message over there. And we're going to constantly work on the quality content that we're putting out here and try to give you honest perspective from one coast to the other. And that way everybody can stay safe.
All right. And with that, this is Craig from the West Coast signing out.
And this is Scott signing out from the East Coast. Stay safe, everybody.
Cyber coast to coast. With your hosts, Scott and Craig Schober.